If you've seen the show Vikings, you might remember the episode where Ragnar captures Paris by sneaking into a coffin. If you're like me, you might have thought that was a pretty interesting plot point. Well, we wouldn't be alone, as that was already a popular trope in chronicles from the Middle Ages. While it was never attributed to Ragnar Lothbrok, medieval scholars did write a number of accounts on how similar tactics were used by several other Viking and Norman leaders in the past. Now the question is, are these just stories, or did this trick actually work in real life? To find the answer to this question, we will have a look at the historical records that mention this tactic. There are several of these, most borrowing the story from earlier chronicles or oral tales. From one story to the other they might have slight differences, but here is the general outline of how this tactic plays out. The fortifications are too strong for the attacking force to overcome. The leader of the attackers fakes their death and wishes to be buried in the settlement. The settlement complies, as having the body of a famous leader would bring them notoriety and gifts. The covered body of the deceased is brought into the settlement with a small entourage. The person is revealed to be alive and attacks from within the walls, opening the gates for the main force to enter. Before we continue, please consider leaving a like or a comment and subscribe to my channel, which will make the YouTube algorithm recommend this video to more people. And if you feel like I deserve it, you can support me further by leaving a super thanks on this video, or supporting me through Patreon or YouTube memberships. These tales are found in a variety of countries. In England, for example, a trick like this is used in the Hyde Chronicles, written in the 12th century. In that case, an Anglo-Saxon rebel uses it against the Norman invaders. There's also a 13th century French work called Jehan de Lançon, Chanson de Geste, which also features this trick. But we won't look further into these stories, as it's fairly clear that these were inspired by earlier Norman stories. And in fact, most of the accounts featuring this tactic were written by Norman or Scandinavian scholars and portray Norman or Viking characters using this trick. There are many medieval stories that incorporate this premise, but many of them are just that, fictional stories. But the text we will look at today are chronicles written about historical events or people. So these are our best shots at uncovering how much of this is actually based on reality. I will take a look at these 4 accounts, and by looking at the differences and similarities, as well as where they take place, who they're attributed to and who they're written by, I will try to piece together where this story originated from and if there's any historical truth to this. It appears to have been most popular in the mid-11th century, as there are a number of instances of the tale taking place during this time, and incidentally, the first 2 texts we will look at both take place in the same general area as well, that being southern Italy. The first account attributes the tactic as being used by one of the most well-known characters in Scandinavian history, Harald Hardrada. This text comes from the Saga of Harald Hardrada, which is part of the Heimskringla, written and compiled by the Icelandic historian Snorri Sturlson around the year 1230. The story itself takes place around 200 years before that, however, around the year 1040, when Harald was the leader of the Varangian Guard and taking part in a campaign on the island of Sicily.
The 4th castle which Harald came to was the greatest of all we have been speaking about. It was so strong that there was no possibility of breaking into it. They surrounded the castle so that no supplies could get into it. When they had remained here a short time, Harald fell sick and he betook himself to his bed. He had his tent put up a little from the camp, for he found quietness and rest out of the clamor and clang of armed men. His men went usually in companies to or from him to hear his orders, and the castle people observing there was something new among the Varings, sent out spies to discover what this might mean. When the spies came back to the castle, they had to tell of the illness of the commander of the Varings, and that no assault on that account had been made on the castle. A while after Harald's strength began to fail, at which his men were very melancholy and cast down, all which was news to the castle men. At last Harald's sickness increased so rapidly that his death was expected through all the army. Thereafter the Varings went to the castle men, told them in a parley of the death of their commander, and begged of the priest to grant him burial in the castle. When the castle people heard this news, there were many among them who ruled over cloisters or other great establishments within the place, and who were very eager to get the corpse for their church, knowing that upon that there would follow very rich presents. A great many priests therefore clothed themselves in all their robes, and went out of the castle with cross and shrine and relics, and formed a beautiful procession. The Varings also made a great burial. The coffin was borne high in the air, and over it was a tent of costly linen, and before it were carried many banners. Now when the corpse was brought within the castle gate, the Varings set down the coffin right across the entry, fixed a bar to keep the gates open, and sounded to battle with all their trumpets, and drew their swords. The whole army of the Varings, fully armed, rushed from the camp to the assault of the castle with shout and cry, and the monks and other priests who had gone to meet the corpse and had striven with each other who should be the first to come out and take the offering at the burial, were now striving much more who should first get away from the Varings. For they killed before their feet every one who was nearest, whether clerk or unconsecrated. The Varings rummaged so well this castle that they killed all the men, pillaged everything, and made an enormous booty.
While the text refers to the settlement as being a castle, it was probably meant to refer to a fortified city. An interesting distinction here compared to the other stories is that they didn't wait to be properly inside the city, and that as soon as they entered the city limits, the coffin was dropped to lock the gate open, allowing the full force of the attackers to storm inside from the start. This is a good story, but still, Snorri was 200 years removed from the event, and while he used earlier Norse sources to base his work off of, 200 years is still more than enough time for embellishments and false information to creep into the telling of how real events unfolded. So it's highly likely that it didn't play out exactly as told here, but which bits are true and which parts have been embellished is unknown to us. We can do better in this regard though, as our second text was written by William of Apulia in the late 1090s, and his work Gesta Roberti Guiscardi, or The Deeds of Robert Guiscard, covers the life of none other than Robert Guiscard, the Norman Duke of Apulia and Calabria. The part of the book we will look at takes place about 50 years earlier in the 1050s, and was commissioned by Robert's son Roger, who succeeded him as Duke. These events take place during the Norman conquest of southern Italy, and Robert led the campaign to take the region of Calabria from the Byzantine Empire.
While he plundered hither and thither, he was unable to capture any castrum or city, and so he resorted to a stratagem to enter a certain place, which was very difficult of access, since there were many inhabitants, and the monastic community which was living there would allow no stranger to enter. The cunning Robert thought up an ingenious trick. He told his people to announce that one of their number had died. The latter was placed on a bier, and on Robert's order was covered with a silk cloth which concealed his face. Swords were hidden on the bier under the body's back. The body was carried to the entrance of the monastery to be buried there, and this pretended death deceived those who could not be taken in by living men. While a simple funeral service was being conducted, the man who was about to be buried suddenly sprang up. His companions seized their swords and threw themselves on the inhabitants of the place who had been deceived by this trick. What could those stupid people do? They could neither fight nor flee, and all were captured. Thus, Robert, you placed your first garrison in a fortress. He did not, however, destroy the monastery, nor did he expel the monastic community from it. Robert gathered a very powerful force in this castrum, and became even more beloved by his men, since he was both mighty in war and wise in council. He was called the Count of this region and considered as such, especially by those who were accompanied by their own following of knights.
The way this plays out is similar to the norm, with just the one difference that Robert himself does not fake his own death, but he lets one of his men do it instead. This account seems promising. It covers real events, it was written down relatively soon after the event, and a trick like this would fit right in Robert Guiscard's wheelhouse, as his nickname, Guiscard, means the cunning, and he is known to have used multiple clever tricks in battle. There is still a question we have to answer though. Can this story be corroborated by any other chroniclers, or is this sequence of events unique to William of Apulia's account? Apart from William, there were two other prominent sources covering the history of the Normans in Italy from around the same time period. The deeds of Count Roger of Calabria and Sicily, and of Duke Robert Guiscard, his brother, which is a very long title to a book and was written by Geoffrey Malaterra. Then you also have The History of the Normans by Amato of Montecassino. Now, another annoying thing is that William doesn't mention the name of the settlement where this story takes place, so we have to figure that out first before we can learn if it has been written about in these other sources. So what do we know about this place? We know that it was of course in Calabria, it was very hard to access, and a monastic community lived there. After Robert captured it, he used it as a base of operations. Later in the story, William also mentioned that Robert was in this place while his brother Humphrey was dying. So keeping that information in mind, if we look at Geoffrey Malaterra's account and go to the part where Humphrey dies, we can find the name of the place Robert came from.
Count Humphrey ruled over Apulia most gloriously and in a praiseworthy and peaceful manner. But he was taken ill and, sad to say, died. Guiscard was at that time staying at San Marco. On hearing of this, he was extremely sad and hastened to Apulia, where he was received by all the leading men from his land, who made him lord and count over them all in his brother's place.
Let's have a look at this place, San Marco. The physical geography seems to match with William of Apulia's account, and while I could not find a direct mention of a monastic community having lived there, the name San Marco does seem to imply religious connotations. Next, we should look into how Robert came into possession of it, and Geoffrey does talk about this as well.
While Robert Guiscard was dwelling at Scribla, gallantly waging war against the Calabrians, he saw his men sickened because of the place's unhealthiness and bad air, and so he sought for a healthier spot. He did not, however, go further away, like a coward who retreats to avoid his enemies, but rather, as though advancing against his foe, he transferred his base to a nearby castrum called San Marco, which he fortified. But after the castrum had been established, he was unable to obtain supplies for it, for those who dwelt nearby had taken their property into the nearby castrum to prevent them being taken by his men.
This is not exactly the same as William's version, yet there are enough similarities to know they are talking about the same place. The castle of Scribla was given to Robert, so San Marco would be the first fortification in Calabria that he captured himself. And as the text states, it is located further into Calabria compared to Scribla. Yet it appears that he was the one that made San Marco into a fortification. and that is also corroborated by the castle that is still standing in San Marco today, which is of Norman design. Also, from the way it's written in Geoffrey's account, there doesn't really feel like there was much of a struggle to get in there. It feels more like he just walked in, as Geoffrey doesn't mention any difficulty, resistance, or need of a trick for Robert to take the place. Amato of Montecassino also mentions Robert using San Marco as his base, but he gives even less details, so there's not much to add here from his account. Also, William writes of Robert being celebrated and loved by the people, but looking at this part of Geoffrey's text, I get a different vibe. It is worth noting that William was asked to write his work by Robert's son and successor Roger, who probably wanted William to write this work in order to shine a good light on his father, and thus also strengthening his own claim over the region. So, is the inclusion of this trick an embellishment of the true story, or was William of Apulia just able to give more detail on the capture of San Marco, whereas the other sources just gloss over it? Sadly, when thinking about the reasons why the work was written, I think it is probably an embellishment. But if so, where did the concept of this trick come from? Keep in mind that Harald Hardrada's instance only takes place about a decade or two before Robert's, and it also took place in the same region of the world. Could William have heard of Harald Hardrada using this tactic, thought it sounded cool, and attributed Robert with using a similar trick to emphasize how clever he was? If this is what happened, that would of course mean that William's account was false, but at the same time that would also give credence to Harald's story being real. Or most likely, both of these stories were embellishments, but in that case there must be an earlier story on which both of these are based. So to find the origin, we should look further back. Perhaps if we try to look for the earliest known character in history to have been credited with using this strategy, we might find some answers. That leads us to Gesta Danorum, which can be translated as Deeds of the Danes, or History of the Danes, which was written by Saxo Grammaticus, and he attributes the trick being used by Frotho I, which was one of Denmark's early legendary kings. Saxo was himself from Denmark as well, and he was tasked with writing a history on the Danes and their ancestors. When exactly it was written is unknown, but based on the contemporary events that take place in his books, it is thought to have been written around the year 1200. In this story, Frotho is on a campaign in Eastern Europe, when he comes across a heavily fortified town in the area which is now Belarus.
He took his army to the city of Palitska. They knew no force could overcome it. He exchanged war for guile, went into a dark and unknown hiding place, only a very few being in the secret. Ordered a report of his death to be spread abroad, so as to inspire the enemy with less fear. His obsequies being also held in a barrow raised to give the tale credit. Even the soldiers bewailed his supposed death with a mourning which was in the secret of the trick. The rumor led Vespasian, the king of the city, to show so faint and feeble a defense, as though the victory was already his. The man got a chance of breaking in, and slew him as he sported at his ease.
And only a little further in the book, King Frotho uses a similar tactic again, this time when he's on a campaign in Britain.
The Frode attacked London, the most populous city of Britain, but the strength of its walls gave him no chance of capturing it. Therefore he feigned to be dead, and his guile strengthened him. For Delman, the governor of London, on hearing the false news of his death, accepted the surrender of the Danes, offered them a native general, and suffered them to enter the town that they might choose him out of a great throng. They feigned to be making a careful choice, but beset Delman in a knight's price and slew him.
So King Frotho is the earliest person credited with this tactic, as he is thought to have lived around the 5th or 6th century. but I'm afraid we've gone back a little too far. As I mentioned before, Frodo was a legendary king, and I mean that in the literal sense of the word. This story is a legend, and with Saxo writing this around 700 years after it's meant to have taken place, it's highly unlikely any of this actually happened, especially as during this time the Vikings would not have reached places mentioned in this story for another few hundred years. So while the time period Saxo wrote about, if it had been true, would have been the earliest occurrence of this trick being used, as we have seen, Saxo himself, writing around 1200, was by far not the first to write about such a trick. His tale is also quite different to the other ones we've seen, as many of the main plot points I outlined in the beginning are missing or different, such as in the first instance Frodo uses his trick. The main goal is not to sneak into the city, but to use the fake death of their leader to lower the defenders' guards, achieving this with rumors, acts of mourning, and even building a fake burial mound, which would have taken a lot of effort. The second instance, in London, does incorporate a force entering the city under false pretenses, but the fake death person does not enter the city themselves, which is the main trope of the story. So Saxo's account is a dead end in finding the origin of this story. But I did want to include it in this video as it might have some connection to another text we will look at next. It is possible that Saxo based the part about London on a story written a few hundred years earlier by Dudo of Saint-Quentin, who wrote about a Viking raid onto the Italian town of Luna. In Norse texts, Luna is referred to as Lunaborg, while London was known as Lundunaborg, so mixing the two up would be an easy mistake. So if Saxo based his story on the story found in Dudo's texts, could Dudo also have inspired the earlier stories we have seen? When we look into Dudo, we find that Dudo's account is the earliest written record of such a tactic being used. And when we look at when it's meant to take place, we also find that it's meant to have taken place way before any of the other texts. That is, of course, if we don't count the story of King Frodo. As well as being the earliest, Dudo's account is also by far the most detailed in describing the stratagem. So it is fair to say that if we take the viewpoint that all those other stories we have looked at so far all were fabrications, it would be highly likely that the inspiration for those fabrications came from Dudo's chronicle. Now again, we need to look deeper into this one to see if this earliest known version of the story has any historical truth to it. Dudo of Saint-Quentin wrote his work Gesta Normannorum, or Deeds of the Normans, sometime between the years 996 and 1015. The part in question is about the Viking raid into the Mediterranean, which from contemporary accounts from the Mediterranean we know is an event that did actually happen. More specifically, it took place in the years 859 and 860. Dudo himself came from the region of Picardy, but while he was visiting Normandy, he made a good impression and was asked by the Duke of Normandy, Richard I, to compose a history of the Normans. Dudo credits the Viking leader Hastein with coming up with this tactic, but he was not a big fan of the pagan ancestors of the Normans, and as you will soon hear, Dudo particularly detested Hastein. Just as a side note, Hastein actually has quite a lot of aliases or alternate spellings to his name. You might also know him as Hasting or Hastingus, or Anstin, which is how Dudo refers to him in these texts. I should also mention that the theory back then was that the Vikings came to Scandinavia from Dacia. I just wanted to give you that context, as it does come up a few times in the following text. In Gesta Normannorum, Hastein, after raiding France, learned about the holiest of cities in Christendom, Rome, and he wanted to raid it.
Anstin, the most vile one of all, spoke for all of them. The breezes we have wished for are becoming frequent, and gentle favorable winds are blowing a path for us. If it does not displease you, let us go to Rome, and subject it to our lordship as we have Francia. This advice was very pleasing to them all, and once the sails had been selected by the booty takers, they turned their prows away from the Frankish shores. For indeed, having been carried far and wide over the deep billows, and having claimed for themselves lands on both shores, wishing to arrive secretly at Rome, mistress of nations, they sailed to the town of Lux, which is called Luna. Thus, the leaders of the city, terrified at the fearful assault of such men, fortified the town with very many armed men. The blasphemer Anstin, judging that the city could not be captured by all the arms in the world, devised the deceitful measure of a most abominable fraud. Thus he sent a messenger to the count of the city and to the bishop to say the following words to them. The messenger, standing in their sight, poured forth such words before them, saying, Anstin, Duke of the Dacians, and likewise all his followers, ejected with him by lot from Dacia, send you faithful service. It is not unknown to you that we, ejected by lot from Dacia, delivered by the whirling motion of the marvelous high waves of the sea, were carried around all the seas through the wave-driven main to the realm of the Frankish-born nation. Also we attacked this realm, granted to us by the allotment of the gods. We much struggled with all our strength in battles against the Frankish-born nations, and we overthrew the whole region at the command of our lord. But wishing, when all had been subjugated to our authority, to return to the land of our birth, bruised first by unfavorable north winds, afterwards by contrary west and south winds, all unwilling, we barely swam to your borders. We have not come to pillage your town by the sword, nor to escort the booty of your district to our boats. We do not have the strength for that, having been fatigued by so many dangers. We beseech you to grant us a negotiated peace. Let us be permitted to buy what is needful. Our Lord, enfeebled and filled with much grief, wishes to be redeemed by you through the salvation-giving font, and to become a Christian. And should he, in this infirmity, fall prey to death, to be buried in this city through your mercy and your compassion. Hearing this, the prelate and the count replied to the go-between, saying, We are in favor of making with you a pact of never-ending alliance, and of making your lord a Christian. Moreover, the go-between reported to his lord that the most abominable of all men, everything he himself had said fraudulently to them, and everything he had heard, deceitful from them. Thus, once the negotiated peace had been enacted, the treasonous pagans and the Christians have dealings with one another, both through many agreements and through many purchases, and also through common assemblies. Meanwhile, the bath is being readied by the bishop, but it will not benefit the treasonous one. The waters are sanctified, drained from the well's whirlpool. The tares are lit for the sacred mystery of the bath. The impostor Anstin, malevolent deviser of the deceitful measure, is carried in. Treasonous, he enters the font, which cleanses only his body. Impious, he has received baptism to the destruction of his soul. He is received from sacrosanct baptism by the bishop and the count. Anointed with sacred chrismon oil, he is escorted as though he were sick. He is not physically ill, but a wretch mentally diseased through the pursuit of treachery. Bleached in body alone, he is carried off as though sick to the ship's company. Thus, he immediately calls together the most vile ones of all to consult about his fraudulent deceit. He has made known to them the detestable secret which he has conceived, born of his mad heart. When night is falling, notify the prelate and the count that I am dead, and earnestly request, weeping greatly, that they have me buried, a neophyte, in their town. Say that you will give them swords and armbands and whatever is rightfully mine. Moreover, they, coming as they had been bidden, before the lords of the city, have said, wailing, Our lord, your godson, the grief has passed away. Wretched, we pray that you have him buried as in your monastery, and take back those extremely great presents which he, dying, bade be given to you. And they indeed, ensnared by such sophism, and almost blinded by the giving and receiving of presents, have pledged that his body would be taken back and properly interred in the monastery. Moreover, the calamity-causing go-betweens, having marched back, have reported what they had fraudulently procured. Then that insolent, mischievous one, rejoicing over their replies, summons the chief of each and every clan. Moreover, when they had all been assembled, Onstan, more vile than the most vile of them, has said, Now make a bier for me, and place me upon it as though I were dead. Place my arms in it, and with me, with lamentations, station yourselves in a ring around them. Go howling through the streets, and compel your followers bewail me. Let your cry raise a tumult throughout our tents. Let the cry of those who preside over the ships sound along with that of the rest of the troops. Have armbands and belts borne before the bier. Display axes and swords adorned with gold and gems. What that calamity-causing one had commanded is no sooner said than done. The bawling of howlings and the roar of mourners is heard. The mountains resound, ringing with the cries of deceitful moaners. The prelate calls together from the flat lands the nations scattered throughout the whole city, and the clergy comes, clad in religious garments. Likewise, the leaders of that town, who are to be crowned by martyrdom. The feminine sex is present, to be escorted into exile. Of one mind, they proceed to meet that monster placed on the bier. Schoolboys carry candlesticks and crosses, preceding their elders. Onstan, placed live on the bier, is carried by the pagans, and the Christians encounter the pagans at the city's outlet. He is carried by both peoples to the monastery, where the tomb has been prepared for him. The bishop prepares himself to celebrate a mass for his godson. And in the choir stands the clergy, accustomed to singing most ceremoniously. The Christians to be butchered do not recognize the deceit of the deadly fraud. The mass is recited, solemnly celebrated. All the Christians partake of the mystical sacrifice of Jesus Christ. These festivities of the Mass having been properly completed, and the pagans gradually assembled, the prelate has ordered the body brought forward for burial. The pagans with great bawling would beg for the bier, and say one after another that it ought not to be buried. The Christians would stand firm, stunned by their replies. Then Onstan has jumped down from the bier, and snatched his flashing sword from its sheath. The calamity-causing one has attacked the prelate, who is holding a book in his hand. He is slaughtering the prelate, and, having overthrown the count, the clergy standing defenseless in the church as well. The pagans have blocked the doors of the sanctuary, so that no one can slip away. Then the frenzy of the pagans butchers the defenseless Christians, all upon whom the enemy's furious hits are delivered to the slaughter. They vent their rage within the enclosures of the shrine, as do wolves within the pens of the sheep. Women stifle the groan in their hearts and pour out useless tears. Young men and maidens are bound together with thongs. The last day of life befalls them all, and for all of them this lifetime is brief and irretrievable. Those doing battle overthrow all the hardier ones with whom they meet inside the walls of the town. The citizens are exhausted, grieving as Mars vents his rage. That nation which was presiding over the ships is now at the gates, open in both directions. With sword point glittering, the iron battle line stands closely drawn, ready for the slaughter. From both sides, they join those already battling, fighting on every side. In a cruel manner, they slay all with whom they meet who stand against them by force of arms. At length, the duel is drawn to a close, for, alas, the company of Christians has been slain. For indeed the rest of the lamentable band is led away to the ships. Raging Onstan's frenzy is at rest, because the leaders of the town have been overthrown. Onstan would boast with his followers, supposing that they had captured Rome, the head of the world. He gives thanks that he holds the monarchy of the whole empire through that town, which he would reckon as Rome, which is the mistress of nations. After he has learned that it is not Rome, moved by anger, he has said, "Take booty from the entire province and torch that town. Conduct the captives and as much spoil as possible to the ships. Let the tillers of the soil of this land feel that we have busied ourselves in their territory. What loathsome one commands, the attendant rejoices to comply with. The whole province is attacked and vanquished by a most vile enemy. The greatest possible carnage is brought to pass. Captives are led to the ships. By sword and fire they ravage everything which has been in their presence. Once these things are completed, they load the ships with captives and spoil. Now they turn to the prows to lead them to the realm of the Frankish-born nation. They traverse the sail-winged sea, returning to the realm of Francia."
I think we can all agree that was a great story. You can really feel Dudo's hatred for Hestein, especially in the part where he gets the baptism. He is not physically ill, but a wretch mentally diseased. Like, damn, that's a pretty sick burn, Dudo. Jokes aside, let's also take a moment to appreciate the long con in this story, which we haven't really seen yet, as the deception in the other stories we've looked at was more straightforward. These Vikings made proper pacts and trade agreements with the people of Luna, and they actually also used them, as it states that they traded many times. Not to mention, Hestein had to go through a baptism and fake being ill and later dead in front of all of them. So what historical evidence do we have to support this chronicle? I will list what we know. Viking raids into the Mediterranean did happen in 859 and 860. A lot of marble was mined in the area around Luna, so it grew rich and incorporated marble in its own buildings, which would make it look very similar to Rome. However, by the time our story takes place, Luna's economy would have already been in decline for quite a while. Multiple medieval sources mention that Luna was destroyed at some point. Saint Secardus of Luni, Luni being the modern-day name for the town of Luna, was a bishop around the time the story takes place, and he is seen as a martyr killed during a raid on the city, for which he was later made into a saint. The raid of Luna by the Vikings is mentioned by other writers, but Dudo is the only chronicler to mention it was done by Hestein through the use of this trick. Around 10 years earlier, Luna was also sacked by the Saracens. There is one more significant point I have to mention. Whereas Dudo writes from a foreign land about the destruction of Luna, there are also local stories that seek to explain the destruction of the city. The earliest records of this story being written down comes to us from a Renaissance text, but the story written in this text is thought to be derived from earlier oral stories, and it goes something like this.
The Lord of Luni was a young and handsome man, adorned with that type of male beauty which is known not to leave female hearts indifferent. Now it happened that an emperor came to live in that neighbourhood with his wife, who promptly fell in love with the young lord. Her passion was reciprocated, and the couple agreed upon a ruse to satisfy their desire. The wife feigned death and was duly buried. The prince then broke into the tomb and eloped with her. Unfortunately, the injured husband was not slow in discovering the trick. He had the two lovers slain and the city levelled to the ground.
Variations to this story also exist, where the wife is just a royal and her paramour is a simple innkeeper, but the plot remains the same. Petrarch, who was a local to Tuscany, mentioned Luna in his work as well. His book, Itinerarium Syriacum, written in the 14th century, doesn't mention the story directly, but he compares Luna to Troy, implying it was destroyed through some sort of trickery. One of the sources I used to research this video suggests the story about the lovers is thought to be derived from a Byzantine romance story about King Solomon and his unfaithful wife. I couldn't seem to find this original story, however, But while looking into it, I came across Procopius's Secret History, written sometime in the 550s. In this book, he spills secrets about, among others, the Byzantine general Belisarius and his wife Antonina. Procopius had written historical works on their lives, but in this book, Secret History, he describes them in a less favorable light. Procopius had served Belisarius as his secretary for a number of years, so he was quite close to them and probably knew a lot of intimate details. And the way he does describe them fits in with the characters of the royal couple described in this story. He describes Belisarius as a faithful husband, but Antonina is described as an unfaithful wife. She would have affairs behind her husband's back, and apparently had a long-standing affair with Theodosius, which Procopius describes as a handsome young Thracian, which could be a link to that handsome young lord of Luna in this story. Now this might be just a coincidence, but there's one more thing. Luna was recaptured by the Byzantines during the Gothic Wars, and the general in charge of this Italian campaign was none other than Belisarius. Procopius was working under Belisarius at this time, and it's also known that Antonina tended to accompany Belisarius on his military campaigns, and Procopius writes she did in this case as well, and she did also play significant parts during this conflict. Alongside them, Antonina's lover Theodosius was also present here. Belisarius had actually, in the decade previously, taken Theodosius under his wing, treating him as an adoptive son of sorts. It was during this time that Antonina met him and they started their affair. Apparently they weren't very discreet and a lot of the staff knew it was going on, yet Belisarius himself remained blissfully unaware. That might be referenced in the local story as well, with there being an emperor and a lord. If Belisarius is meant to be the emperor and Theodosius the lord, that could give a parallel to the father-son relationship they might have had, with Theodosius being under the care of Belisarius, and in monarchical hierarchy a lord could also be under the rule of an emperor. After the Italian campaign, Belisarius finally found out about the affair and he had Antonina arrested. I do have to make clear that for this part, linking the local stories about Luna's destruction to Antonina and Belisarius, I don't have any concrete sources backing me up on this connection. This is just me speculating, but I do want to include this in the video as there do seem to be a lot of similarities between the two. Now of course these could very well be a lot of coincidences, and it's also worth pointing out that in Procopius's account there's no mention of any death trick being used, and even Luna, the place itself, isn't even mentioned directly. But still, it could be the case that inspiration for that local destruction story of Luna was taken from the lives of Antonina and Belisarius, especially seeing as a lot of the campaign during the Gothic War took place in this general area. Anyway, after that long tangent, we'll go back to looking for the connection between Dudo's Viking story and this local Italian story. What we have here is two stories from two different cultures on the destruction of the same town, both referring to it being related to someone playing dead. Now the question becomes, what is based on what? Did Dudo's story inspire the local Italian stories, or is it the other way around? While the local tale wasn't written down for around 500 years after Dudo, if it was based on earlier oral stories, it's likely that the local story already predated Dudo by hundreds of years. Dudo didn't travel to Italy, so maybe both stories are based on an earlier story that was more widely known across Europe, and both could have independently taken inspiration from that earlier one. But again, that seems too coincidental. Maybe there could have been an early version of this story specifically referring to Luna, already written down somewhere and the text being lost over time. Or maybe it doesn't have anything to do with any earlier story after all. And the locals somehow got a hand on Dudo's account of the area, and they based their story on that one of Dudo's, even though I don't see Norman history being that popular in northern Italy. Okay, now I'm rambling, but I just want to keep that in because we can't say which one is true, so I just want to give you all the possibilities. And while spilling all these possible options out there, I'll give you some more to choose from. Dudo, in other parts of his history, has also been known to attribute acts carried out by the Saracens to the Vikings. So another possibility is that maybe a trick like this was used by the Saracens when they raided Luna around 10 years before the Vikings. Or what about the option that the Vikings did actually use this trick, and the story is true? Or wait, the Vikings went there, destroyed the city, heard the story that the Saracens sacked the city like 10 years earlier using that trick, thought, oh, that's smart, we should have done that, and then when they come home they just told everyone, oh, we used that trick. Now all of these options mentioned could be linked with Saint Guiscard, who, as you might remember, was killed during this time and died as a martyr. But then again, that just confirms that either the Saracens or the Vikings killed him during one of their raids, and does not necessarily mean that either of them used this trick to get into the city. Okay, so let's have another look at that list that I've noted down earlier about the things we know. So you have basically covered all of those and tried to connect it to Dudo's story. So then we also had that local story and that it's possible links to the Byzantines, but then do we have anything that links the Byzantines to Dudo's story? Wait, I think I figured it out. The Byzantines in 552, they must have used this trick to get into the city. Belisarius' wife was having an affair with the Lord. She faked her death to get away from her husband, and then Belisarius used the death trick to sneak into the city. He missed his signal to attack. Then he was placed in the tomb, and when he jumped out of his coffin, he found his wife and the Lord of Luna in the tomb as well, very much not being dead and eloping. And then the city was destroyed. So that links Dudo's story to the local story, and that solves the mystery. Now, of course, I'm joking here, but I think it's probably time to stop looking so deep into this, as we don't have any more leads to go on. And I seem to have delved into the conspiracy theory level options here. I'll go back to being serious now. All of these options could, apart from that last one, could be a possibility, but it's all too muddled to be able to figure out what exactly happened here. But it's safe to say that the probability of Dudo's account being true is rather low. Looking at all the information we have, we can be fairly certain something bad involving trickery did happen here and resulted in the town being destroyed, but elements of multiple possibilities are incorporated in these stories. Now I'll give you one last possibility. Dudo's story and the local story aren't based on each other, but they could both be independently based on an earlier story or event that took place here in Luna. Now, I just joked that the Byzantines were at the origin of all this, but even though I don't have any evidence to support that, for all we know, the Byzantine capture of Luna could have links with these stories. I already explained earlier the possible links between the local story and Belisarius and Antonina. And in that same vein, that being me just speculating, it could also have links with Dudo's story. We know the Byzantines captured this city, yet we do not know exactly how. There might be a slight possibility that they used the trick to get into the city, and maybe that trick was one about faking a death. Which, if they did, could link them to both stories. Again, I have to reiterate, this is pure speculation, and I am grasping at straws here. Another thing to point out is that Luna was mistaken for Rome, and thus must have also looked similar to Rome, and that is supported by the marble industry that existed here. A lot of marble from Luna was used in the town itself, but was also exported to Rome. At this time, during the 6th century, Luna's economy was still doing well, and the way the city would have looked described in the Viking story is probably more similar to what it looked like in the 6th century compared to the later 9th century in which it's meant to take place. Still, I highly doubt any of that actually took place, as there isn't any evidence of there actually being a siege or even a fight at the town of Luna itself. We just know the Byzantines took over this area of Italy as a whole. A more likely, yet still unlikely, option to consider is that Procopius, or another historian from around that time, wrote something along the lines of this story down about Belisarius and Antonina, of which no records survive, but it found its way to the locals of Luna, and maybe by the time of Dudo it still was floating around in a text somewhere, which Dudo then came across somewhere and used it to incorporate it into his own story about the Vikings. Now I've given all the options of the possible origins of this story. We'll probably never know exactly what it was, or it could have even been based on something entirely different. We'll probably never know. Now, just because this first written account of the trick being used probably didn't actually happen, doesn't necessarily mean that this tactic was never used. Maybe this trick was really used in an earlier time and we just don't have any record of it. Or because this first one wasn't true, doesn't mean that it couldn't have really happened later on in the future. Maybe some later leaders read Dudo's story and were inspired by it. Seeing as the popularity of this trick rose in the century after Dudo wrote it, perhaps maybe Harald Hardade or Robert Guiscard was familiar with the story, and maybe unaware that the original story wasn't true, they might have actually tried to use this tactic in real life, and that's how we get to their stories. Now, to be honest, I don't think any of the accounts we have here are actually based on reality. But if I had to pick one that I thought would be most likely to be true, it would have probably been the one about Harald Hardade, or possibly the one about Robert Guiscard. Those, in my opinion, had the highest chance of actually being based on reality. So to answer the question I posed at the beginning of this video, there's no concrete answer and it's up for debate. But hopefully, now you know the full context behind these stories, you can decide for yourself which one of the possibilities you would support. I am interested in hearing what you guys think, so please leave a comment below with your thoughts. If you like what I do, please subscribe, and you can consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a channel member. I'd like to thank my existing patrons for their support, especially my $25 patron G. David.